He searched for her for 5 years. When he finally found her, she was holding his children. 5 years. 1,820 days of chasing ghosts, bribing informants, and staring at a photograph until the edges went soft and the face inside it started to feel like something he'd invented. Kong Minj had built an empire on certainty, on knowing exactly where every piece on the board was at all times. But for 5 years, the one piece that mattered had been missing, and the not knowing had been eating him alive from the inside out. If you've ever loved someone so completely that losing them didn't just break your heart, but broke your entire sense of reality, stay with me. Because this story is about to show you what happens when the truth finally surfaces. And trust me, it's more devastating than the silence ever was. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The town didn't have a name worth remembering. That was probably the point. It sat on the western edge of Portugal like something the ocean had coughed up and forgotten. A cluster of whitewashed buildings, a harbor that smelled of salt and old rope, a single road that wound down from the hills and died quietly at the water's edge. The kind of place people came to when they needed the world to stop looking for them. Tourists passed through in July and August, bought ceramic tiles and cheap wine, and left without learning a single local's name. The rest of the year, the town exhaled, went quiet, kept its secrets the way old stone keeps cold, deep and without apology. Kong Minj had not come here for the scenery. He'd come because 3 weeks ago, a low-level surveillance contractor he kept on retainer in Lisbon had flagged a transaction. A small cafe purchase, a credit card number attached to a name that didn't exist 5 years ago. The kind of thing that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. But Minj had spent 5 years learning exactly what to look for. He'd built an entire secondary operation around a single obsession, and his people knew it. They knew better than to let anything slide past him. He sat in a rented car at the top of the hill for a long time before he drove down. His hands were steady on the wheel. That was the thing about Kong Minj that people always got wrong. They expected someone like him to be visibly dangerous, to have the edges showing. But he was still in the way that deep water is still, and anyone who'd spent more than 10 minutes in a room with him understood intuitively that the stillness wasn't calm. It was compression. It was everything held back behind a surface that didn't crack. He drove down the hill slowly. The cafe was on the corner of the main square, across from a small fountain that had probably been beautiful once and was now just functional. Hand-painted sign above the door, blue shutters. A chalkboard outside listing the day's specials in Portuguese and English. 2 tables on the sidewalk, both empty because the morning was still cold, the kind of damp Atlantic cold that got into your joints and stayed. He didn't park in front. He parked half a block down, cut the engine, and sat. He told himself he was being methodical, professional, that he needed to observe before he moved. He told himself a lot of things in the 60 seconds he sat in that car, with his hands still on the wheel and his chest doing something complicated that had nothing to do with methodology. Then he got out. The bell above the cafe door made a small sound when he pushed it open. Ceramic tiles on the floor, the same blue and white pattern that covered half of Portugal. Wooden tables, a glass pastry case, the smell of coffee, and something sweet baking somewhere in the back. 3 customers. An old man with a newspaper, 2 women talking quietly over espresso cups. And behind the counter, her back to him, reaching up to adjust something on a high shelf. Minj stopped. His brain did something he hadn't experienced in years. It went completely, absolutely blank. She was thinner. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a loose knot at the base of her neck. She was wearing a plain white shirt and an apron, and she moved the way she'd always moved, with a kind of unconscious efficiency, no wasted motion, like someone who'd learned early that the world didn't give you extra time, so you'd better not waste what you had. He knew that movement. He knew it the way he knew his own heartbeat. He hadn't let himself believe it until this exact second. That was the truth he wouldn't say out loud to anyone, that for 3 weeks since the contractor's flag had come through, he'd been operating on pure mechanical function, processing information, following protocol. Because believing it and being wrong would have been the thing that finally finished him, and Kong Minj did not allow himself to be finished. She turned around. The moment she saw him, she dropped the cup she was holding. It shattered on the tile floor and neither of them moved. The old man with the newspaper looked up briefly and looked back down. The two women paused their conversation. Minge watched her face go through 5 years of suppressed emotion in about 4 seconds. Shock. Recognition. Something that might have been relief if it wasn't immediately buried under something harder and colder and much more guarded. "We're closed," she said. Her voice was steady. That was the first thing he noticed. Her voice was completely steady. "It's 9 in the morning," he said. "We're closed for a private event." Amara. The name hit the air between them like a stone hitting water. She flinched. Just barely. Just for a second, but he saw it. "That's not my name," she said. "It's the only name I've got for you." He took one step forward. 5 years. You've been here 5 years. You need to leave. I'm not leaving. One of the women at the table stood up, reading the room with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to read rooms the hard way. She touched her companion's arm, and they both moved toward the door without being asked, leaving money on the table without looking at the bill. The old man with the newspaper didn't look up, but folded it slowly, like he was giving himself options. "Get out of my cafe," Amara said. She wasn't raising her voice. That was almost worse. The flatness of it. The absolute refusal to give him anything. "Get out of my town. You can't seriously think I'm going to walk out that door after 5 years. He heard the roughness in his own voice and didn't try to smooth it out. He was done smoothing things out. "You were dead. You were gone, Amara. I had people telling me you were dead. I spent—" He stopped, pressed his jaw shut, started again. "I need you to tell me why. You know why. I don't." "Then you're either lying or you're stupid," she said. "And I know you're not stupid." She came around the counter then, and he noticed 2 things in rapid succession. First, that she moved with the particular purposefulness of someone who'd decided to be angry because anger was manageable and the alternative wasn't. And second, that she was trying to angle him toward the door, which meant she was trying to get him out before something happened that she didn't want to happen. He didn't understand what that something was yet. He found out approximately 45 seconds later. The back door of the cafe opened and 2 small people came barreling through it with the unconstrained kinetic energy of children who haven't yet learned that the world expects them to be quieter than they actually are. A boy and a girl, identical in the round-faced, wide-eyed way of twins who were still young enough that the differences between them were subtle. 5 years old, maybe. Dark hair. The boy was slightly taller. The girl was louder, already narrating something about a cat she'd seen in the alley. They stopped when they saw Minge. Children that age are perceptive in ways that adults underestimate. They don't have the vocabulary for what they're sensing, but they sense it. The charge in the room, the particular quality of adult stillness that means something serious is happening. The girl grabbed her brother's arm without thinking about it. The boy looked at Minge, and Minge looked back at the boy, and the floor shifted beneath him. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a conclusion he reasoned his way to. It was older than thought. Older than reason, some recognition that operated at a level below language, below logic, below everything he'd built himself into over 35 years of hard living. He was looking at a face he knew. He was looking at a face he'd seen in photographs of himself at that age. A face his mother had kept in a box that he'd found after she died. A face that looked like the earliest version of everything he'd become. He was looking at his son. Amara. His voice came out different. He barely recognized it. She stepped in front of the children immediately, not theatrical about it, just a simple, instinctive repositioning, the same way you'd put your hand out to stop someone from stepping into traffic. Automatic. Maternal. And in that single gesture, she told him everything she hadn't said. "Go in the back," she said to the children quietly, in a voice that brooked no argument. "Now." The girl pulled the boy with her. He went, but he looked back at Minge over his shoulder as he went through the door, and Minge couldn't breathe. The door closed. The cafe was silent except for the low sound of something still baking in the back kitchen. "How long?" Minge said. It wasn't really a question. He knew how long. He was doing the math, and he didn't like the answer, but the answer wasn't going to change regardless of whether he liked it. "Don't. How long were you pregnant when you left?" "This is not a conversation we are having in my cafe. Then we'll have it somewhere else. But we're having it." He looked at her, really looked at her. Not the way he'd been looking for the past 5 minutes, cataloging changes, processing information, keeping himself at a clinical distance because the alternative was drowning, but actually looked at her, at the exhaustion under her eyes that wasn't just from a morning shift, at the way she was holding herself together with something that wasn't quite strength and wasn't quite stubbornness, but was some particular combination of both that he'd always, even when he was furious at her, even now, found devastating. You raised them alone. Something moved across her face. She killed it fast. I made a choice, she said. You made it without me. You made yourself unavailable. The flatness cracked, just barely, just at the edges. You did that, not me. I don't know what you think you saw. I know what I saw. You know what it looked like. Don't you dare! She moved toward him then, not retreating, moving toward him, and he realized this was the thing she'd been holding down since the moment she recognized him in the doorway. This specific, targeted fury that had 5 years of accumulated pressure behind it. Don't you stand in my cafe and tell me that my own eyes lied to me. I was there. I saw you. I saw her. I know what that looks like, Kong Minj, and I didn't imagine it. I rejected her. That's not what I saw, because you didn't stay long enough to see the rest of it. He kept his voice level with effort. He wanted to match her energy, wanted to give her back the 5 years of fury that he'd been carrying around on his own side of this equation, but he held it because he understood, somewhere underneath the anger, that she was scared right now, and fear makes people's hearing worse. You saw a moment in the middle of something. You didn't see what came before, and you didn't see what came after, and you ran before I could. I didn't run. She said it like she was correcting a factual error. I left. There's a difference. I left because I couldn't look at you. I left because I was pregnant and alone, and I just watched the man I thought I knew. I couldn't. She stopped. Reset. When she spoke again, the fury had gone somewhere quieter and colder. I couldn't give my children a father who would do that. I didn't do that. You saw Yi, he said, and you saw exactly what she wanted you to see. The name landed differently than he expected. He'd expected more anger. What he got instead was something more complicated, a flicker of something uncertain, something that wasn't quite doubt, but was in the neighborhood of it, quickly suppressed. Don't blame my sister for your choices, she said. I'm not blaming her for my choices. I'm telling you she set it up. I'm telling you it wasn't. He stopped himself, pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his forehead. We can't do this here. Not like this. We need time. Real time. Not. He gestured vaguely at the broken cup still on the floor, the empty cafe, the 5 years of wreckage between them compressed into a 10-minute conversation. Not this. There is no we, Amara said. There hasn't been a we for 5 years. There are 2 kids in that back room who might disagree with you about that. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were doing something complicated, and he couldn't read all of it, but he could read enough. You're not taking them, she said. The quietness of it was the most frightening thing she'd said so far. I'm not here to take anyone. He held her gaze. I'm here because you've been alive this whole time, and you let me believe. He stopped again. Something in his chest was doing something he hadn't permitted it to do in a very long time, and he was not going to let it surface in a cafe in Portugal. He was not. I need you to understand how long 5 years is. I know how long 5 years is, she said very quietly. I counted every day. The admission clearly wasn't one she'd meant to make. He watched her recognize what she'd just said and try to take it back without taking it back. Then you know, he said. She turned away from him, picked up the broom that hung on a hook by the counter and started sweeping up the broken cup. Not because it needed to happen urgently, he understood, but because she needed something to do with her hands. He recognized the impulse. He'd developed his own version of it over the years. Movement as control. There's a restaurant at the end of the harbor, she said without looking at him. 7 o'clock. The kids go to sleep at 8:30, and I will be back in time for that. You get until 8. That's an hour. That's what I'm offering. He looked at her back, at the knot of hair at the base of her neck, at the slight tension in her shoulders that she was trying very hard to make look like no tension at all. I'll be there at 7, he said. He walked to the door, pushed it open. stopped with one hand on the frame and looked back once, and she was still sweeping, still not looking at him, and it was the most present he'd felt in 5 years, and also the most completely wrecked. He walked out into the cold Atlantic morning. He sat on a bench by the fountain for a long time, long enough for the cold to work its way through his jacket, long enough for the square to fill up a little with morning foot traffic. A woman with a dog, 2 old men on their way somewhere, a delivery truck grinding its gears on the narrow street. He took out his phone and called the one person he called when things went sideways in ways he hadn't accounted for. "How bad?" said the voice on the other end. Han Seo, his second in command, who had been with him for 12 years and had learned to calibrate the severity of situations by the way Minj breathed when he picked up the phone. "She's alive," Minj said. A pause. "I know. You told me 2 weeks ago." "The kids, Seo." His voice didn't crack. He wouldn't let it crack. "The twins, they're mine." A longer pause. "You're sure?" Han Seo said. Not a question exactly. More like a man buying himself a second to process. "I looked at the boy and I was sure," Minju said. "You know how I know things sometimes." "Yeah." A breath. "Yeah, I know. I need you to run Yi." "What about her?" "Everything. From the beginning. I want every interaction she had with Amara in the 6 months before Amara left. Every conversation we know about. Every place Yi was. Every contact she had. Every piece of communication." He paused. "I think she set us up." Another silence. This one different from the others. "If she did," Hanso said carefully, "and you can prove it." "I know." "Minch, bullshit." "I know what it means. Run it anyway." He looked out at the harbor. The water was gray-green this morning, the surface restless with a wind coming off the Atlantic. Somewhere down there, he could see the restaurant she'd mentioned, white walls, red awning, the kind of place that looked like it had been there for 100 years and planned to be there for 100 more. "I have a meeting at 7. I'll call you after." He hung up. He sat with the cold and the gray water and the weight of what he now knew. 5 years of searching, and the answer had been here all along in a town too small for maps that mattered. 2 children with his face, a woman who'd built a whole life in the space his absence had left. And somewhere in Seoul, he was increasingly certain, a sister who had stood back and watched all of it happen. He sat there until his hands stopped shaking. It took longer than he was comfortable with. At 7 o'clock exactly, he walked into the restaurant at the end of the harbor. She was already there. Of course she was. Sitting at a table by the window with her hands wrapped around a glass of water and her eyes on the door, watching him the way she used to watch him when they first met, before she knew him well enough to stop being careful. He sat down across from her. The waiter came and he ordered something without looking at the menu, and she did the same, and when the waiter left, they were alone with the candlelight and the sound of the water outside and 5 years of things that hadn't been said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Tell me what you think happened," she said. "All of it. Don't skip anything." He told her. Every detail he remembered of the night she'd disappeared, the conversation he'd been in the middle of when Yi had come into the room, the way Yi had positioned herself, what he'd said, what he'd done. He'd gone over it 10,000 times in his own head. He knew it like a script. When he finished, Amara was quiet. "She told me you'd been seeing her for months," she said finally. "She showed me." She stopped, looked at the table. She had photographs. She had messages. Something cold moved through him. "Photographs of what?" "You, together." Her jaw tightened. "They looked real. They were staged. They had to have been staged." "I know that now." She said it very quietly. "I think I knew it then too, somewhere. But I was pregnant and terrified, and I had already been scared that you were—" She stopped again. "You were always so—" She made a small, frustrated gesture with one hand. "You didn't let me in, Minj. You kept so much closed, and I was scared that I'd been wrong about you the whole time. And when Yi showed me those things, I thought—" Her voice dropped. "I thought maybe I'd just been seeing what I wanted to see." "You weren't. I know." She looked at him then. "I know that now. But I didn't know it then. And by the time I had enough space to think clearly, I had 2 newborns and no—" She shook her head. "I couldn't go back. I didn't know how to go back." You could have called me. To say what? I think I made a mistake? Also, you have children? Her voice was sharp for a second, then softened. I was ashamed. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I was ashamed and I was angry and I was scared, and by the time all three of those things settled into something manageable, 5 years had gone by. He looked at her across the candlelight. He'd had 5 years to decide what he would say if he ever found her. He'd had 5 years of imagined conversations, 5 years of accumulated things he needed her to understand. And now she was sitting 3 feet away from him, and none of it felt like enough or like the right shape of thing. Their names, he said. Tell me their names. Something crossed her face, the closest thing to vulnerable he'd seen from her tonight. Ji Woo, she said. The girl. And she paused, and what happened in that pause told him something she hadn't meant to tell him. The boy is Ji Hoon, his grandfather's name. She'd named his son after his grandfather, who had died 3 years before they'd met, who Minj had talked about once, just once, on a night when he'd let his guard down far enough to be honest about where he came from. She'd remembered. She'd been gone. She'd been hiding. She'd been building a life in a town without a name. And she'd given her son the name of his grandfather. He didn't say anything about it. He couldn't. There was no version of him that could sit in a restaurant and speak calmly about what that meant. He picked up his water glass instead, put it down without drinking. I need you to trust me one more time, he said, just enough to let me prove what ye did, and then you can decide what you want, but I need you to give me the chance to prove it. Amara looked at him for a long time. Outside, the harbor was dark now, the water invisible beyond the restaurant window, the lights from the boats making small reflections on the surface. The candle between them had burned down a little. She opened her mouth to answer, and then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something in her face changed, not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming shut. It's the babysitter, she said. She answered it, listened, and in the space of 6 seconds, every bit of color left her face. She stood up so fast her chair scraped back. What happened? Minj was already standing. She looked at him, and it was the first time tonight that she looked at him without any defenses up at all. Just pure, exposed terror. They're gone, she said. Both of them. Ji-woo and Ji-hoon. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Someone took my children. The babysitter's name was Katerina. She was 17 years old, and she was sitting on the front step of Amara's house when they got there, knees pulled to her chest, face white as the wall behind her, crying in that particular way of someone who has been crying long enough that the sound has gone out of it, and only the physical motion remains. Amara was out of the car before it fully stopped. Minj was half a step behind her. Tell me exactly, Amara said, crouching in front of the girl. Her voice was controlled in a way that cost her something visible. Minj could see it in the tendons of her neck. Take a breath and tell me exactly what happened. Katerina took the breath. It shuddered, going in. They were in the bath, she said. Both of them. I was in the hallway. I could hear them talking. They do that thing where they make up stories to each other. She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second. I went to get their towels from the closet. It was maybe 2 minutes. When I came back, the bathroom was empty, and the window... She looked up at Amara. The window was open. I looked everywhere. I called out, and nobody... They were just gone. Minj was already moving past them, through the front door, up the stairs. The house was small, the kind of small that spoke of careful management of money, every centimeter used intentionally, children's drawings on the walls of the staircase, a pair of small rain boots by the door, one tipped on its side. He found the bathroom at the end of the hall, window facing the back of the house overlooking a narrow alley. Screen pushed out. He leaned over the sill and looked down, a drop of maybe 4 feet to a stone ledge, then another short drop to the alley floor. Easy enough for an adult carrying children. There were scrape marks on the ledge below, fresh ones. He heard Amara come up behind him. Professional, he said, without turning around. He kept his voice flat because flat was the only register that was going to be useful right now. They knew the layout. They knew the window. This wasn't improvised. Who? It wasn't a question. It was a word she said like she was biting down on something. He turned around. She was standing in the bathroom doorway, arms crossed over her chest, and she was looking at him with something that was half fury and half the most naked fear he'd ever seen on a human face, and he understood that the crossing of the arms wasn't defiance, it was the only thing keeping her together. "I have a theory," he said. "Don't give me a theory, give me a name." Yi. The name hit her like a physical thing. She didn't flinch this time. She went very still instead. "Yi doesn't have the resources to—" "Alone? No." He watched her face carefully. "But she's had 5 years, Amara. 5 years to find people who do. And there's a family in Seoul. The Parks. Park Junho. His father ran guns and money for 20 years before I dismantled most of his operation. Junho has been looking for leverage on me since." He paused. "A man's children are leverage." Amara uncrossed her arms, put one hand flat against the doorframe like she needed the wall to be solid right now. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that your enemies took my children. Our children." "Don't." Her voice cracked. Just once. Then it sealed back over. "Don't do that right now. I don't have room for that right now." He let it go. She was right. There was an order to things that needed addressing, and the order started with finding Ji-woo and Ji-hoon, and everything else came after, no matter how much the everything else was pressing against the inside of his chest. He took out his phone and called Han Seo. "I need you in Portugal," he said when Seo picked up. "Bring Chen and whoever else you trust, and pull everything we have on Junho's current operation. Location of assets, communication intercepts, current personnel, everything." "When did this get activated?" Seo's voice had shifted into its operational register. Clean, focused, no affect. "Tonight, the children were taken." He looked at Amara when he said it. She was looking at the floor. "Move fast." He hung up. Amara walked past him to the window, looked out at the alley below for a moment. Then she turned around and walked to the children's room at the end of the hall and sat down on the edge of the bed that was smaller of the two. The boy's bed, he understood, looking at the things on the shelf above it, and put her face in her hands. He stood in the doorway. He didn't go to her. He understood instinctively that going to her right now would be the wrong move. Not because she didn't need it, but because she wasn't ready to need it from him specifically, and pushing it would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose tonight. So he stood in the doorway, and he let her have the 30 seconds that she was allowing herself. And when she lifted her face from her hands, he was still there, steady, not looking away. "What do you need from me?" he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. He didn't know how. "Everything," she said. "Tell me everything you know about Yi's movements in the last year." "I don't know them. Not yet. Seo is running it now." "Then what do you know?" He came into the room then, not to her, but to the small desk in the corner where he pulled out the chair and sat and started pulling up what he had on his phone. "What I know is that Yi dropped off my radar about 8 months ago. No social media activity, no appearances at family events, no contact with anyone connected to me. At the time I thought she was embarrassed. She'd made a play 5 years ago, and it hadn't gone the way she expected. I didn't look at it harder than that." He paused. "I should have." "Yes," Amara said. "You should have." He took that. He deserved to take that. 8 months of planning, she said. She was thinking out loud now. He recognized the pattern. She'd always done that when she was trying to solve something. She'd let it out into the air and examine it from the outside. "She knew you were looking for me. She had to have known you'd eventually find me. So she—" Amara stopped. Something moved across her face. "She planned for when you found me. She planned for exactly this. Which means she's been watching you," he said. "Here, in this town. She knew where you were." "For how long?" "I don't know yet." Amara stood up from the edge of the bed. The motion was abrupt, almost violent. She walked to the window of the children's room and looked out at the dark street. "She knew where I was," she said. "And she didn't come. She waited. She waited for you to find me first." She turned around. "Why?" Minj had been sitting with that question since the moment he'd seen the scrape marks on the ledge below the bathroom window. He had an answer that he didn't like. "Because this isn't about you," he said carefully. "It was never primarily about you. You were a means to an end. She needed to separate us, and she needed to make sure there was no chance of reconciliation. But the actual target was always me, my organization, my empire." He held her gaze. "The children aren't leverage against you, Amara. Their leverage against me. The silence that followed that had a specific texture. Dense, almost pressurized. She sold us to the Park family, Amara said. Not a question. She traded something they wanted. Access to me, information about my operation, a way to force my hand, for the resources to do this. He put his phone face down on the desk. Junho has been trying to get inside my organization for 3 years. He doesn't have the patience for it anymore. A direct play is faster. Using children, the flatness of her voice said more than anger would have. It's what people do when they're desperate and they don't have anything else. She looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening behind her eyes that he couldn't fully read, and that bothered him. He'd spent 5 years thinking he knew how to read her, and now he was realizing that 5 years had changed things, had added layers he didn't have the map for. You have to find them, she said. I will. That's not enough. I need more than I will from you right now. I know where to start looking. He picked up his phone again. Junho has a property network in Southern Europe. Shell companies, mostly. Warehouses, logistics facilities. He uses them for transport operations. If he's holding them anywhere within 6 hours of here, it's going to be one of those. How long to narrow it down? CEO's team can have a working list in 2-3 hours. 2 or 3 hours, she repeated. I know. She crossed the room in 4 strides and stopped in front of him. He was still sitting and she was standing, and she looked down at him with an expression that he was going to carry for the rest of his life regardless of how this ended. If anything happens to them, she said, because of what you are, because of what you built, because of the enemies you made, I need you to understand that there is no version of that I recover from. There is no conversation after that. There is no... She stopped. Her jaw worked once. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand, he said. Good. She stepped back. Then make sure nothing happens to them. He stood up. They were the same height, close enough that he could see the exhaustion and the terror and the 5 years of doing everything alone all layered on top of each other. And he made himself look at all of it because looking away from it felt like the same kind of dishonesty that had cost them everything the first time. I'm going to need you to trust me, he said. Not forgive me. Not anything else. Just trust me enough to let me move. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Move, she said. His team arrived at 2 in the morning. Hanso came through the front door of Amara's house with Chen and 2 other men Minj knew by reputation and trusted by track record, and they took over the small kitchen table with laptops and phones and the particular concentrated efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before and understood that speed was a currency with a hard expiration date. Amara sat at the corner of the table and watched them work and didn't speak unless spoken to. And nobody spoke to her unless they needed to, and Minj moved between the table and the window and the hallway in a circuit that he wasn't entirely aware he was running until Seo caught his eye from across the room and gave him a look that said, quietly and without words, you need to hold it together right now. He stopped moving, stood by the window with his arms at his sides. At 2:47 in the morning, Chen looked up from his laptop. Got something, he said. Seo was at his shoulder before he finished the word. Minj crossed the room. Property registered to a shell company out of Luxembourg, Chen said. Cargo facility? Abandoned, or supposedly abandoned, about 40 kilometers north of here, back from the coast. He turned the laptop to show the satellite image. Thermal imaging from a drone passed 20 minutes ago shows 2 small heat signatures in a building that's supposed to be empty. Minj stared at the screen. 2 small signatures. That's them, Amar said from across the table. She'd stood up without him noticing. She was looking at the screen over Chen's shoulder, and her voice was very quiet and completely certain. We don't confirm until we have visual, Theo started. That's them, she said again, not louder, just with more weight behind it. How fast can we get there? 40 minutes, maybe 35 minutes, Minj said. He looked at Seo. How many people does Junho have on site? Thermal shows 8 warm signatures, adult-sized, 2 inside with the children, 6 on the perimeter in 2-man positions. Our team? 4 plus you. If you count Ms. Seo glanced at Amara. She doesn't count, Minj said, at the exact same moment that Amara said, I count. They looked at each other. You're not coming to the extraction, Minji said. They're my children. which is exactly why you're not coming. You're not trained for this, and if something goes wrong and you're there, if something goes wrong and I'm not there, Amara. He kept his voice level and hated how level it needed to stay. If you're there and Junho's people see you, they will use you, the same way they're using Jiwoo and Jihoon. You become another variable I have to protect instead of... He stopped. Let me do this. Let me do the one thing I can actually do right now. She looked at him for a long, suspended moment. If you bring them back, she said, I want to be the first thing they see. You will be. And if you don't, I will. Minj, I will bring them back. He said it once more quietly and without decoration, because there was no force in the universe that was going to make the alternative into something he would accept. Stay here, stay with Katarina, we'll call when we have them. She said nothing, which, from her, in this moment, was as close to permission as he was going to get. He turned to his team. They moved out at 3 a.m. The road north was empty. Winding coastal highway, fog coming in off the water, the headlights cutting through it in long yellow cones that revealed nothing further than 20 meters ahead. Minj sat in the passenger seat and went through the satellite images on his phone and said very little, and Chen drove and Seo rode in the back with the other 2 men, and the car was quiet in the way that cars get quiet when everyone inside them understands what's waiting at the destination. At some point, Seo said from the back, "You doing all right?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," Minj said. "Good," Seo said. "People who say yes right now are the ones I worry about." Minj looked at the road ahead. Somewhere in the fog to his left, he could hear the ocean. Distant, steady, indifferent. He thought about Ji-hoon looking back at him over his shoulder as he went through the cafe door that morning. The small, searching quality of that look. A 5-year-old who didn't know yet what he was looking at, who had no language for the thing he was sensing. His son, who didn't know he had a father. He pressed that thought down and put it somewhere that he could reach after. The facility appeared out of the fog at 3:41 in the morning. A low concrete building behind a chain-link fence, no lights visible from the road. They parked half a kilometer back and covered the last distance on foot, moving through scrubland that was wet from the fog and made no sound under their feet. Seo's team took the perimeter positions first. Minj watched on the earpiece feed as they neutralized the 6 exterior guards with a precision that produced no gunfire. Subdued, restrained, professional. Minj had been specific about the terms. He didn't want this loud. He didn't want this to escalate into something that put 2 5-year-olds in the crossfire. That left 2 inside with the children. He went through the side door with Chen. The interior was a single large space, mostly empty. Concrete floor, high ceiling, a few stacked crates. In the far corner, under a single bare bulb, 2 adults sat in chairs facing each other across a folding table. Between them, on a cot that someone had placed there with at least the minimum of consideration, 2 small figures lay curled together under a single blanket. Jiwoo and Jihoon, asleep or close to it. Breathing. Minj stood still for 1 second and just confirmed that they were breathing. Then everything happened very quickly. The 2 guards were professionals. They had their weapons up before Minj and Chen had fully cleared the doorway. But professional doesn't make you faster than preparation. And Minj had spent the 40-minute drive running contingencies while Chen had spent it visualizing entry geometry. It was over in under 2 minutes. Nobody shot. Both guards were restrained and zip-tied to the crates. Minj crossed the room to the cot. He crouched down. Jihoon was facing him, lying on his side, one hand curled under his chin, the way small children sleep when they're trying to make themselves compact. His face was wet at the temples, recently cried, recently exhausted, but sleeping now, cheeks flushed and warm. Minj reached out and put one hand very carefully on the boy's shoulder. Jihoon's eyes opened. They looked at each other in the thin light of the bare bulb. The boy didn't scream, didn't cry, just looked at him with that same searching quality from the cafe doorway that morning, that same trying to locate something he didn't have words for yet. "Hey," Minj said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Hey, it's okay. I've got you." Jihoon looked at him for another second. Then he said very quietly, with the simple directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to disguise what he feels, "Are you here to take us to Mama?" Minj's chest did something that he was not going to let show on his face. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly why I'm here." He picked the boy up. Ji-hoon was heavier than he expected, solid and warm the way children are, with an absolute trust in the arms holding him that children extend without evidence and adults spend their whole lives trying to earn back. He stirred Ji-woo with one hand and Chen was there immediately, picking the girl up when she woke confused and starting to cry, talking to her in the low, steady voice of someone who understood children enough to know the tone mattered more than the words. They moved toward the door. They were almost through it when Minja's earpiece crackled. It was one of Seo's men. Outer perimeter. Voice clipped, controlled, with something underneath it that wasn't quite alarm but was in the neighborhood. "We have a problem," the voice said. "There's a vehicle incoming from the North Road, moving fast. It's not one of ours." Minj stopped moving. Ji-hoon tightened his grip around Minj's neck without waking up. "How many?" Minj said quietly into the mic. "One vehicle. But the registration..." A pause. "It's not Park Family. The registration comes back to a subsidiary of a company that Seo flagged 2 days ago in the Yi investigation." Minj looked at Chen across the sleeping bodies of the children. "Yi is coming here herself," Chen said. Not a question. "She's coming to confirm the job was done," Minji said. "Or she's coming because she knew we'd find this place and she wants to be here when we do." "That's insane. She's been insane for 5 years," Minj said. "She's just been patient about it." He made the decision in the space of 3 seconds. "Get the children to the cars," he said to Chen. "Now, move." He looked at Seo's man through the earpiece. "Intercept the vehicle. Don't let it leave. And do not let the person inside know we have the children until I say so." He passed Ji-hoon to Chen. The boy stirred, confused, half awake, and turned back toward the interior of the building. Because if Yi was coming here tonight, then tonight was the night this ended. All of it. Not tomorrow, not in a courtroom, not in some future conversation where evidence got presented through proper channels and everyone got to maintain their composure. Tonight, in a concrete warehouse 40 kilometers from a town that had no name worth remembering, the woman who had stolen 5 years of his life and built a trap around his children was going to have to look at him and explain herself. And he was going to be standing there when she did. He was halfway back across the warehouse floor when his phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't recognize. He stopped and looked at it. 4 words, no punctuation, no explanation. "She has a gun." He stared at the message for 2 full seconds. Then a second message arrived from the same number, and this one stopped the blood in his veins. "So do I. And Amara isn't at the house anymore. She followed you. She's outside right now. And Yi knows." The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Minj was standing in the middle of Amara's living room, which had become something unrecognizable in the past 3 hours. A command center assembled from grief and necessity. Hanseo's people spread across every surface with laptops and phones, and the particular focused silence of men who understood that speed was the only currency that mattered right now. Maps on the coffee table, satellite imagery on 2 screens propped against the wall, a whiteboard someone had found in the back of the cafe and dragged up the stairs, already covered in timeline notations and contact names. Amara sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, doing the thing she'd been doing for 3 hours. Staying completely still because movement meant acknowledging that her body existed in a world where her children had been taken from it, and she wasn't ready to acknowledge that yet. Minja's phone buzzed. Unknown number. Portuguese prefix, but that meant nothing. He answered it on the second ring. "You look tired," said the voice on the other end. Female. Calm in the way that people are calm when they've decided they have nothing to lose. "Portugal doesn't suit you, Minj. You should come home." He knew the voice. Of course he knew the voice. He'd known it for 28 years since the first time he'd heard it, high and clear, and already, even at 7 years old, carrying that particular undertone of wanting something it wasn't going to ask for directly. "Yi," he said. Amar's head came up. Across the room, Hanseo went very still. "I've been watching you all day," Yi said. "You and my sister, having your little reunion, very touching. Did she cry? She used to cry so easily. It used to drive me absolutely insane." A pause. "She doesn't cry as much anymore, does she? 5 years will do that to a person. Where are the children?" He kept his voice flat. Not a question, not a demand. Just the words, delivered with the specific texture of a man who had shut every unnecessary thing down and was operating on pure, stripped-back focus. They're fine. They're sleeping, actually. Ji-woo takes forever to go down, but Ji-hoon, that boy could sleep through anything. He gets that from you, I think. The stillness. Another pause, and in the pause he could hear something that might have been her moving, a soft sound of footsteps on a hard floor. I've spent 5 years thinking about this conversation. Then talk. I want you to come home, alone. Leave my sister in her little seaside fantasy and come back to Seoul and we'll discuss the terms. Terms. Of the arrangement. You and me, Minj. The way it should have been from the beginning. Her voice didn't change. Still that same flat calm, still that same register of someone reading from a script they'd written so many times they'd stopped being able to hear how it sounded. You wasted 5 years on a ghost. I'm offering you something real. He looked at Amara. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, jaw set, eyes too steady, the look of someone who had understood enough from one side of a conversation to know the shape of what was happening and was holding herself together by sheer force of practiced will. If you touch them, he said into the phone, I will dismantle everything you've ever built and everyone you've ever known. I want to be clear about that. I want you to hear exactly what I'm saying. I'm not going to touch them. Yi sounded almost offended. They're my niece and nephew. I'm not a monster, Minj. What you are, he said, is someone who faked photographs, destroyed 5 years of 2 people's lives, and kidnapped children. So you'll forgive me if your self-assessment and mine don't align. A silence. 48 hours, she said. Come to Seoul, alone. And we'll talk about bringing the children home. The line went dead. He lowered the phone. The room was completely quiet. Outside, the harbor made its small, constant sound. Water against stone, indifferent and continuous. She has them, Amar said. It wasn't a question. She has them. Amar stood up from the table. She moved to the window and stood with her back to the room for a moment, and he watched her shoulders rise and fall with one single controlled breath. And then she turned around and her face was the most frightening thing he'd seen all night. Not because it showed panic, but because it showed the absolute absence of it, just cold surgical clarity. Tell me what we're doing, she said. Han Seo looked at Minj. Minj looked at Amara. We're going to Seoul, he said. She said alone. She said a lot of things tonight. I'm not inclined to take her instructions. He crossed to the whiteboard and looked at what his people had assembled. Flight logistics. Known Park Family Holdings in Seoul. Yi's last confirmed location before Portugal, which, now that he was looking at the timeline with fresh information, told a story he should have seen earlier. She'd been in Lisbon 3 weeks ago, right around the time his contractor had flagged Amara's credit card transaction. He stared at that for a moment. Seo, he said. The flag, my contractor in Lisbon. Han Seo was already ahead of him. I've been thinking about it for the last hour. She fed it to us. That's what I think. The room went a degree colder. One of Han Seo's men, a quiet one named Pak, who handled electronic surveillance and rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying, looked up from his laptop. She wanted you to find her, Pak said. She wanted you to come here. She needed you on the ground in Portugal, away from your network, when she made her move. Minj stood very still. He had walked into this town believing he was the one who had found something. He had spent the last 12 hours believing he had the initiative, that he was the one showing up unannounced, disrupting someone else's carefully constructed piece. He had not been the one with the initiative. He had been the piece being moved. How long has she been in contact with the Parks? He said. His voice was very quiet. That's what I'm trying to determine, Pak said. But based on what I'm seeing in their communications pattern, the encryption shift, the new routing infrastructure they stood up about 8 months ago, I think at least a year, maybe longer. A year. Yi had been coordinating with the Park family for at least a year, while Minj had been searching for Amara, while his attention and resources had been divided, while he'd been operating with the persistent low-grade distraction of a man who had never fully accepted that the most important person in his life was simply gone. Yi had been building something. He turned away from the whiteboard. Get the plane ready, he said to Han Seo. We leave in 2 hours. All of us? Minj looked at Amara. She was already looking at him. That same stripped-down clarity in her face, the one that had appeared when Yi's name came up and hadn't left since. "I'm going," she said, before he could respond, before he could form the words that would have been some version of asking her to stay safe, to stay here, to let him handle it. "Don't." She cut the air with one hand, a small, sharp gesture. "Don't tell me to stay. Don't tell me you'll handle it. Those are my children." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. "Stay close to Seo on the plane," he said. "When we land, you do what I say, when I say it. No exceptions." "Agreed." "I mean it, Amara." "So do I." She held his gaze without blinking. "Let's go get our kids." The flight to Seoul was 9 hours and 40 minutes. Minj spent most of it at the small table in the back of the aircraft, working through what Pak was feeding him in real time. Financial records, communication intercepts, location data reconstructed from a year's worth of digital breadcrumbs that told the story of Yi's arrangement with Park Junho more completely than he'd wanted to know. Amara sat across from him for the first 4 hours without speaking. He was aware of her the entire time, aware of her in the particular way he'd always been aware of her, the way that had never turned off regardless of what had happened, regardless of 5 years and a missing person and 2 children he hadn't known existed until this morning. It was the kind of awareness that doesn't require eye contact or proximity. It just runs underneath everything else like a frequency you can't turn off. Around hour 5, she spoke. "She's been planning this since before we were together," Amar said. He looked up. She was looking at the documents on the table between them. Pak had sent over a reconstructed communication history, and she'd apparently been reading it upside down for the past several minutes, with the focused attention of a woman who had learned to read situations from incomplete information and trust her own conclusions. "What makes you say that?" he said. "This." She turned one of the pages around and pushed it toward him. A communication thread, partially reconstructed, dated from 6 years ago, 8 months before he and Amara had met. "She's talking to someone in the park organization. She's talking about you specifically. Your operation, your vulnerabilities, your..." She stopped, swallowed. "Your personal life, what you were looking for. What would distract you?" He read the page. The cold that moved through him was different from the cold he'd felt in the cafe, different from the cold of the harbor in Portugal. This was the cold of something structural, of realizing that the foundation of a period of your life wasn't what you'd believed it to be. He and Amara had met at a gallery opening. He'd thought it was chance. He remembered thinking it was chance. The particular chaos of a crowded room, 2 people ending up at the same painting at the same time, a conversation that started with disagreement about whether the painter had intended the central image to be peaceful or threatening. He remembered thinking he'd been lucky. "She introduced us," Amar said. Her voice was completely flat. "Yi introduced us. I forgot. I hadn't thought about it in years because it didn't seem to matter, but she's the one who told me about the opening. She's the one who said I should go." She paused. "She set us up together, and then when it got serious, she needed a way to end it," Minj said. "She needed a way to end it that left you destabilized," Amar said. "Not just heartbroken. Destabilized. A missing person you couldn't stop looking for. An unresolved loss that would divide your attention indefinitely." Her jaw tightened. "She used me as a weapon against you. She used our relationship as a..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "My sister used me." The words landed in the cabin, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He watched her process it, not the way you watch someone for information, but the way you watch someone because you can't help it, because the particular shape of a person's face when they're absorbing something that reconfigures their entire understanding of their own past is one of the most private things a human being can do, and he had no business watching it, and he couldn't look away. "Amara," he said. "Don't." She shook her head once. "I just need a minute." He gave her the minute. When she looked back at him, the flatness was still there, but something had shifted underneath it. A consolidation, a narrowing of purpose, the look of someone who has finished grieving a thing and moved on to what comes next. "Tell me about Park Junho," she said. He told her. Park Junho, 53 years old, second son of the Park family patriarch, who had spent 20 years building the legitimate face of an operation that had its roots in extortion and its current revenue in smuggling and influence trading. He and Minj had been on a collision course for years, not because either of them particularly wanted a war, but because their respective operations had been expanding in opposite directions, and the middle ground between them was running out. Yi had given Junho a weapon, and Junho, being Junho, had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to use it. "The warehouse," Hanso said from the front of the cabin. He'd been on the phone for the past 20 minutes. "Our people in Seoul found a location, Park Family Holding, supposedly decommissioned 2 years ago. But there's been activity, vehicle traffic, power draw. It's warm." "Where?" Minj said. Hanseo told him. "Yongsan District, near the river. The kind of industrial block that had been waiting for redevelopment for 15 years, and in the meantime had become exactly the kind of place where things happened that weren't supposed to." Minj looked at the map Pak put up on the screen at the front of the cabin. Studied the surrounding blocks, the access points, the distance from the nearest police presence. "When we land," he said, "I want eyes on that location within the hour. Nobody moves until I say. Nobody." He looked around the cabin. "If the children are there and we spook them before we're in position, there are only 2 exits from that block and neither of them ends well. So we wait. We watch. We know exactly what we're walking into before we walk into it." His people nodded. Amara was looking at the map. "There," she said. She pointed to the satellite image on the screen, a specific corner of the warehouse structure, a section set back from the main building with what looked like a ventilation modification, newer than the rest of the roofline. "That's newer construction. Why would you put new ventilation on a decommissioned warehouse?" Pak leaned forward, looked, typed something. "She's right," he said. "That section was modified 14 months ago. Permits pulled under a shell company." He looked at Minj. "Climate-controlled space. You do that for storage, or for people." "For children," Amara said. Her voice didn't shake. He noted that. He filed it away with everything else he was going to spend a long time thinking about when this was over. The plane landed at Incheon at 6:14 in the morning, Seoul time. Gray dawn, low cloud cover, the specific cold of a Korean autumn that had nothing in common with the Atlantic cold of Portugal. Different weight to it. Drier. It hit Minj when he stepped off the plane, and he felt, for the first time since he'd walked into that cafe 20 hours ago, like himself. Like the version of himself that existed in this city, in this context, with these specific tools available to him. He did not examine whether that was a good or a bad thing. His convoy moved through the city efficiently. By the time they reached the staging location, a logistics facility in Mappo that his organization used for exactly this kind of situation, Hanseo's advance team had eyes on the Yongsan warehouse and was feeding back visuals in real time. Minj stood in the center of the facility, coat still on, looking at the drone feed on the monitor. The warehouse was occupied. Thermal imaging showed 9 heat signatures inside, 7 adults, clustered in 2 groups, and 2 smaller signatures together in the climate-controlled section Amara had identified from the satellite image. He looked at those 2 small thermal shapes on the screen for a moment that lasted longer than he would admit to. "The children are alive," Hanso said quietly, beside him. "I see them. We have 12 people. The warehouse has 4 confirmed entry points. If we move in the next—" "Wait," said Pak. He was looking at something on his laptop, and his voice had a quality in it that Minj had learned to pay attention to. Pak was not a man who alarmed easily, and he sounded alarmed. "Something's wrong. The communication pattern just changed. Someone tipped them. Someone told them we landed." The thermal imaging shifted on the screen. The 7 adult signatures were moving, consolidating, pulling back toward the interior, away from the perimeter. Minj looked at the screen. "Who in this room," he said, very slowly, very quietly, "knew our landing time?" The room was silent. He looked at each face. His people. People he had trusted. People he had built the past decade with. Hanso, Pak, 7 others. And then his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, 3 words. "Check your house." He stared at the message. Then he looked up at Amara, who was standing 6 feet away watching the thermal feed with her arms crossed, and something in the architecture of this moment shifted. Something he hadn't seen coming, something that rearranged every assumption he'd arrived with. His secure line rang. He answered it. "They moved the children 20 minutes ago," said the voice on the other end. Not Yi. A man's voice, low and measured, with the particular cadence of someone delivering information they've been paid to deliver. "They knew you were coming. They knew your team composition, your staging location, and your entry plan." A pause. "Someone on your inside gave them everything, Mr. Kong, and the children are no longer in Yongsan." The thermal feed confirmed it. The two small heat signatures were gone. The room felt very different than it had 60 seconds ago. Minj stood in the middle of it, and for the first time in 20 years of building something that was supposed to be impenetrable, he felt the specific, devastating sensation of standing on ground that had already given way beneath him. Not falling yet, but past the point where falling could be stopped. Someone in his organization had been feeding Yi and the park's information. Someone close enough to know his landing time, his staging location, his entry plan. Someone who had been inside his operation long enough to know things that only existed in his most trusted circle. He looked at Han Seo. Han Seo looked back at him with an expression that was either the look of a man who was innocent and understood what was happening, or the look of a man who was very, very good. And for the first time in 12 years, Kong Minj did not know which one it was. The children were gone. His inside was compromised. Yi had anticipated every move. And somewhere in this city, his son and daughter were in the hands of people who had just demonstrated that they were always 3 steps ahead. He stood in the middle of the room with the failed drone feed on the screen and the silence of his people around him, and he understood with total clarity that everything he'd built, every system, every contact, every layer of the organization that had made him untouchable for a decade, had just been turned into a liability. To get his children back, he was going to have to burn all of it down and start from nothing. He was going to have to become something he'd spent 20 years making sure he never had to be again, a man with nothing left to lose and no rules left to follow. He put his phone in his pocket. He looked at Amara. "Get your coat," he said. She didn't ask why. She just looked at him with those eyes that had always been able to read the thing underneath the thing, and she got her coat. And when she came back to stand beside him, she was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her in the cold room, and he said very quietly, so only she could hear, "I'm going to find them. But what I have to do to find them, you need to be ready for what that looks like." She looked at him for a long moment. "I've seen what you are, Minj," she said. "I've always known what you are." She held his gaze without flinching. "Show me." He started with the traitor. Not because it was the most urgent thing, the children were the most urgent thing, would always be the most urgent thing, but because you cannot fight a war when the enemy is inside your walls. Every move he made with a compromised inside was a move they already knew about. Every plan he formed in this room was already in Park Junho's ear before the words finished leaving his mouth. So before anything else, before the next step could be taken, he had to cut the rot out. He did it the way a surgeon works, cleanly, without announcement. He told Han Seo to run a secondary operation, decoy logistics, a false staging location, a fabricated entry timeline fed quietly through the normal channels. Real information only to the people he'd personally vetted in the last 6 hours. Then he watched. Pak monitored outgoing signals, encrypted and otherwise, from every device in the facility. It took 41 minutes. The signal came from a burner, cycled through 3 relays, but Pak was better than 3 relays. He traced it back to a man named Cha, mid-level logistics coordinator, 8 years with the organization, the kind of man who is so reliably unremarkable that he becomes invisible, which is exactly the kind of man you recruit if you're building a long-term inside source. Minj had 2 of his people walk Cha into the back room of the facility with no drama, no raised voices, nothing that would alert anyone watching from outside that anything had changed. He went in alone. Cha was sitting in a metal chair, and the moment Minj closed the door behind him, the man's face did what faces do when the thing they've been dreading finally arrives. A kind of collapsing inward, a deflation, like a structure whose load-bearing wall has just been removed. Minj pulled a chair up and sat directly across from him, close. Closer than was comfortable. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the man. "How long?" he said finally. Cha looked at his hands. "Cha." Minj's voice was very quiet. The quiet was worse than volume would have been, and Cha clearly understood that. How long? 14 months? Cha said. Yi or Junho? Both. Yi made first contact. Junho's people handled the payments. What did you give them? Cha listed it. Movement schedules, communication protocols, the names and locations of 3 overseas contacts that Minj was going to have to burn immediately, the landing time, the staging location, the entry plan from 3 hours ago. His voice was flat and mechanical, the voice of a man who has decided that the only way through this is to be useful enough that usefulness might matter. Minj listened to all of it without moving. When Cha finished, the room was quiet. The children, Minj said. Where did they move them? I don't know. Cha. I genuinely don't know. That information wasn't routed through me. Junho keeps the location of... He keeps that separate, compartmentalized. Cha looked up then, for the first time, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who understood his situation precisely. I swear to you, if I knew where they were, I would tell you. I have... He stopped. I have a daughter. I know what you're... Don't, Minj said. The word came out with enough weight that Cha stopped mid-sentence. Do not tell me about your daughter right now. Silence. Is there anyone else? Minj said. In my organization. Anyone else they recruited? Not that I know of. They only needed one. Minj stood. He looked at Cha for another moment, at this man he'd trusted with the operational details of his life for 8 years. This unremarkable, invisible, perfectly positioned man, and he felt something he recognized as rage from a great distance, like a weather system on the horizon that he could see clearly and had absolutely no intention of letting reach him. Not yet. Lock him down, he said to the man outside the door. Not comfortable, not painful, just contained. He walked back into the main room. Amara was standing by the window. She turned when he came in, read his face, and didn't ask about Cha. She'd been in the room long enough to understand what had just happened without being told. You knows where they are, she said. You knows everything. He crossed to the map table. Junho keeps the children's location separate, which means there are only 2 people who definitely have that information. He looked at the map of Seoul spread across the table. A city he knew the way you know a body you've lived in for 35 years. Every scar and every shortcut. Junho and Yi. Then we go through Yi. He looked at her. She said it the way she said most things. Simply, directly, without the kind of emotional decoration that makes people feel better and accomplishes nothing. She said it the way someone says a thing when they've already done the math and arrived at the only answer that works and are past the point of being frightened by it. You will run, he said. The moment she knows we're moving, she won't run from me, Amara said. He held her gaze. She's been waiting for me to come back, Amara continued. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that he'd only heard from her twice before. A cold, compressed fury, the kind that doesn't burn hot because it's been under pressure long enough to change state entirely. 5 years she's been living in the space my disappearance created, my family, She stopped, set her jaw. She won't run from me. She'll want to see my face. He thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Pak, he said, where is Yi right now? Pak had been running her location since they landed. Gangnam, her apartment. She's been there since approximately 2 a.m. She's not hiding. Of course she wasn't hiding. She'd won. As far as Yi knew, she'd won. The children were relocated. Minja's entry plan had been burned. His organization was compromised. She was sitting in her apartment in Gangnam, waiting for him to call and accept her terms. She had no idea he'd found her inside man in 41 minutes. We move now, he said. Before she gets any signal that we've adjusted. We have... He looked at the time. Maybe 90 minutes before the silence starts to feel wrong to her. Before she starts wondering why Junho hasn't confirmed the plan worked. He looked around the room. Seo, take 4 people to the secondary location. If Junho tries to move the children again once he hears we've picked up Yi, I want you in position to intercept. He looked at Pak. You're with me. 2 others. That's all. Minj, Hanso said. 4 people is enough for 1 woman in an apartment. It's not the apartment I'm thinking about. Minj looked at him. If this goes wrong, then it goes wrong, Minj said. Get in position. He looked at Amara. She was already putting on her coat. Yee's apartment building was the kind of Gangnam address that announces its own importance. Glass and steel, a lobby that probably cost more than most people's homes. The particular silence of a building that has been insulated against every inconvenient sound the city produces. The kind of place where people believe they are protected by the fact of what they can afford. They went in through the service entrance. Pac disabled the floor's security camera feed on a 14-second loop before they stepped off the elevator. The hallway was empty. 4 a.m. empty. The specific vacancy of a building full of people who believe nothing happens to people like them at this hour. Minj stood outside the door of Yee's apartment. He could hear his own heartbeat. He noted it the way you note weather. Present, factual, not particularly relevant. He tried the door. Locked, obviously. Pac had it open in under 30 seconds with tools that cost more than the door. The apartment was dark. The sole skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows provided enough ambient light to navigate by. The particular orange-gray of a city that never fully achieves darkness. Living room, kitchen, a hallway. The bedroom door was slightly open. He pushed it open with 2 fingers. Yee was awake. She was sitting up in bed, phone in hand, and she saw him in the doorway, and for one fraction of a second her face showed something unguarded. Not fear, exactly, but the pure animal awareness of a creature that has suddenly found the walls of its enclosure much closer than expected. Then she controlled it, pulled it back, replaced it with something composed. "You're faster than I gave you credit for," she said. "Get up," he said. Get up, Yee. Now." She got up. She was wearing a silk robe and her hair was down, and she looked, he thought distantly, exactly like she always had. That particular beauty that had always been slightly too aware of itself, slightly too calculated in its presentation. He'd never been attracted to it. He understood now, with the clarity of a man who has finally assembled all the pieces of something that she had never understood why. She came out into the living room, stopped when she saw Amara standing by the window. And there it was. The thing he hadn't planned for. The specific, devastating contingency of having both of them in the same room at the same time, with the same information, looking at her together. "Amara," she said, and her voice, for the first time, had something genuine in it. Something complicated and old. Something that might have been, underneath all the wreckage, a trace of a real feeling for her sister that had gotten so twisted by jealousy and obsession that it had become unrecognizable even to the person carrying it. "Where are my children?" Amara said. "I told you. They're safe. They're—" "Yee." Amara's voice didn't rise, didn't shake. "Where are they? You need to listen to me. Both of you need to listen to me." Yee turned, trying to distribute the room, trying to make this a conversation instead of what it was. "I did what I did because it was the only way. He was never going to—" She looked at Minj. "You were never going to see it. You were so completely—" "Don't," Amara said. "Don't explain yourself to him. Explain yourself to me." She stepped forward, and Minj noted that he didn't move to intervene, because Amara's voice had the kind of authority in it that doesn't require intervention. "You set us up, from the beginning. You introduced us knowing what you were going to do. You let me fall in love with someone, and then you destroyed it, and you let me run away pregnant and alone, and you watched 5 years go by and you said nothing." She stopped. Something moved across her face. "Did you even know? About the twins?" Yee's silence was its own answer. "You knew," Amara said. "I found out after," Yee said quickly. 6 months after you left, I found out, and by then it was inconvenient," Amara said. "By then, saying something would have meant admitting what you'd done. By then you were gone," Yee said, and there was something raw in it now, something unpeeled. "You were gone and he was—" "You should have seen him, Amara. You should have seen what it did to him. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He had people looking for you on 4 continents. He was so completely destroyed, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought eventually he would—" "Move on," Minj said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I thought eventually you would stop looking and you'd—" She shook her head. "You never stopped looking. 5 years and you never stopped, and I started to understand that you were never going to." Something in her face went tired, went old. "So I decided if you were going to find her eventually anyway, I was going to control the terms." By taking the children, Amara said. By making myself necessary. By being the only one who could give you what you wanted. She looked between them. I have the children. I'm the only one who can bring them back safely. So yes, I made myself necessary. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Minj moved. Not toward Yi, across the room, to the window, his back to both of them, looking out at the Seoul skyline with his hands in his pockets and his jaw tight. He stood like that for 5 seconds. 10. When he turned around, his face had the stillness again, the deep water stillness. Tell me where they are, he said, and I'll give you 24 hours before I make a single call. Enough time to go wherever you're going to go and start whatever you're going to start. He looked at her. That's the offer. It's the only one you're getting. Yi looked at him. Then she looked at Amara. And Amara looked back at her sister with the face of someone who has completed a grieving process in the span of about 4 hours, who has moved through shock and fury and devastation and arrived at the cold, quiet place on the other side, where the only thing left is the decision about what to do next. Take the offer, Amara said, simply, without heat. You take it and go. Take it and... Something moved through Yi's face, complex and fast and, he thought, not entirely without real feeling. The problem with obsession at this scale, he understood, is that it consumes everything, including the capacity to understand what you've consumed. She had wanted him. She had destroyed her sister's life to get him. And standing here in this room at 4 a.m., she was finally having to look at what that actually meant in the physical world. 2 people in front of her who had been through 5 years of damage that she had manufactured, and children somewhere in a building with Park Joon-ho's people, and the ruins of any version of the future she'd imagined. She sat down on the couch. She gave them an address. Minj was on the phone to Han So before Yi finished speaking. The address, the building layout as Yi described it, the number of Joon-ho's people she believed were inside. Seo was already in the area, already in position, already moving before Minj ended the call. Go, he said to the 2 men with him, and they moved Yi to a secondary location. Not comfortable, not the 24 hours he'd offered, not yet, not until the children were confirmed safe. He'd sort out what 24 hours meant after. He and Amara left the apartment together. In the elevator going down, she stood beside him and he could feel her shaking. Not visibly. She had too much control for visible shaking. But he was close enough to feel it, the fine tremor running through her like current through a wire, the body's honest report of what it had been through in the past 18 hours, while the face and the voice reported something more composed. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers briefly, just for a moment, and felt her fingers tighten around his before she let go. They got into the car. His phone was already active. Seo's team, live audio from outside the building, the particular charged silence of people in position waiting for the signal. The address was 20 minutes away. He drove it in 14. The building was an older structure in a transitional neighborhood, the kind of block that was half renovated and half forgotten. Construction equipment on one side, functioning businesses on the other, the general air of a place that hadn't decided yet what it was going to become. A light was on in a second-floor window. He could see the shadow of movement through the glass. He parked half a block down. Seo materialized from a doorway across the street, 4 people with him, positioned with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. 6 inside, Seo said, voice low. Confirmed 2 children on the second floor, rear room, 4 of Joon-ho's people, and Joon-ho himself. Joon-ho is here, Minj said, personally. Apparently he wanted to be present for whatever he thought was going to happen next. Minj looked at the building. Park Joon-ho, in person, in a room with his children. He felt something happen in his chest that he wasn't going to examine in a parking lot in Seoul with Seo standing next to him and Amara 3 feet behind him doing her own version of controlled breathing. He was going to feel that thing later. Right now, he was going to move. Entry points, he said. Front door and a fire exit on the east side. Ground floor windows are barred. Second floor fire escape on the west. Who's on the fire escape? I put 2 people there. Good. He looked at the building again. The moment we breach the front, Joon-ho is going to move toward the children. His play is to use them as leverage. So the fire escape team goes in first. They get to the rear room before Joon-ho does. He looked at Seo. Can your people guarantee that? They're already on the structure, Seo said. They went up 7 minutes ago, waiting for the signal. Minj looked at Amara. She was looking at the second-floor window, at the light behind the glass. Her jaw was set, and her breathing was measured, and she had the look of someone who has compressed everything they feel into a single point of focus, so small and so dense that it becomes a kind of fuel. "The moment the children are clear," he said to her, "you go to them, not before. You wait until Seo tells you it's clear, and then you go directly to them, and you don't stop for anything. Do you understand me?" She looked at him. "Do you understand me, Amara?" "Yes," she said, and then quietly, just for him, "Come back out." He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he turned to Seo and said, "Signal the fire escape team." Seo raised his hand, and everything happened at once. The fire escape team went through the second-floor window fast and silent, the sound of it almost nothing from where Minj stood. He was already moving toward the front of the building, Seo beside him, the other 2 men flanking, the particular compressed urgency of a breach that cannot afford hesitation, because hesitation is the thing that gets people killed. The front door came open on the second kick. The ground floor was dim. A gutted commercial space, concrete floors, exposed ceiling, the smell of dust and something chemical. 2 of Junho's men were positioned here, and they reacted the way trained men react, which is faster than most people expect, but never quite fast enough when the people coming through the door have done this more times than they can count. It was ugly, and it was brief, and Minj moved through it the way he moved through everything, with that deep water stillness that was, in motion, absolutely terrifying because it was so completely without panic. He took a hit to the left shoulder that he noted and set aside. He kept moving. The stairs. Second floor. A hallway. 3 doors. The fire escape team already visible at the far end, and one of them giving the signal. Clear. Rear room clear. Children clear. He went through the middle door. Park Junho was standing in the center of the room with his phone in his hand and the look of a man who has just watched his entire position collapse in real time and has not yet decided how to respond to that. He was 53 years old, and he had the build of someone who had been physically capable once and had grown accustomed to other people being physically capable on his behalf. And standing here without those people, he looked, for the first time, like exactly what he was. A businessman who had badly miscalculated. "Kong," he said. "Junho," Minj said. He was breathing hard from the stairs and the ground floor and the shoulder that was going to need attention. And he was aware of all of it the way you're aware of weather. Present. Factual. "Where's Yi's documentation? The photographs? The manufactured evidence?" Junho looked at him. "You didn't come here to have a conversation about documents," Junho said. "I came here for my children," Minji said. "I have them. Now I'm having a conversation about documents because I want everything Yi fabricated. Every photograph, every message, every piece of manufactured evidence she used against Amara, and I want it in the next 60 seconds. And if I don't, Junho." Minj looked at him steadily. "Look at this room. Look at where your people are. Tell me what you think the leverage situation is right now." Junho looked at the room, at the absence of his people, at Seo standing in the doorway, at Minj, who had a shoulder that was bleeding through his jacket and was standing there like it was a minor inconvenience. "Server," Junho said. He nodded toward a laptop on a table in the corner. "Everything Yi provided is on that server. I kept copies." He paused. "Insurance." "Against Yi," Minj said. "Against anyone." Junho almost smiled. "You understand how this works?" "I do." Minj nodded to Pak, who crossed to the laptop. "You and I are going to have a different conversation. Later. About the geography between our operations and how we ensure this doesn't happen again." He held Junho's gaze. "But right now, I'm going to go see my children." He turned toward the door. "Kong." Junho's voice stopped him. "Yi came to me, you understand. I didn't recruit her. She came to me with an offer, and I took it because it was good business. That's all it was." Minj stood with his back to Junho for a moment. "I know," he said. "That's the only reason you're standing up right now." He walked out into the hallway. At the far end, the fire escape team had brought the children out of the rear room, and Amara was already there. She must have come up the fire escape herself the moment the signal went out, which was absolutely not what he told her to do, and which he was not remotely surprised by. She was on her knees on the hallway floor with both children in her arms, Ji-woo's face buried in her neck, Ji-hoon holding onto her jacket with both fists, and she was talking to them in a voice too low for him to hear, her forehead against first one small head and then the other, and she was shaking again, visibly now, not trying to control it, letting her body have its honest response now that the only thing that mattered was in her arms. Ji-hoon looked up over his mother's shoulder. He looked at Minj, 5 years old, dark eyes catching the hallway light, the particular stillness of a child who has been through something frightening and has retreated to some internal place that children access more easily than adults because they haven't yet learned to be embarrassed by the need for it. He looked at Minj the way he'd looked at him in the cafe that morning, with that quality of recognition that had no business existing in a child who had never met him and yet was completely, undeniably present. Minj crossed the hallway. He crouched down to the child's level. Ji-hoon looked at him. "Hey," Minj said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Hey," Ji-hoon said. "Are you okay?" Ji-hoon considered this with the seriousness that children apply to questions they've decided deserve serious answers. "My sister's scared," he said. "She won't say so, but she is. She cried before, but then she stopped because she said she didn't want to scare me." He paused. "I was scared too. I just didn't cry." "That's okay," Minj said. "Being scared is okay." "Mama says it's okay too." Ji-hoon looked at him with those eyes. "Who are you?" Minj held the boy's gaze. Behind Ji-hoon, Amara had gone still holding Ji-woo, but still listening. He looked at his son, and at the answer to a question he'd spent 5 years not knowing he needed, and at the hallway around them, the mess and the wreckage, and the blown-out aftermath of a night that had cost more than he could currently calculate. And he opened his mouth to say the thing he was going to spend the rest of his life not taking back. "I'm your father," he said. Ji-hoon stared at him. The hallway was completely silent except for the distant sound of the city outside, indifferent and continuous, going about its business while the entire world rearranged itself in a second-floor corridor in a transitional neighborhood that hadn't yet decided what it was going to become. Ji-woo pulled back from her mother's neck and looked at Minj with wet eyes and the fierce, evaluating gaze of a 5-year-old girl who has inherited, apparently, her mother's precise and unsparing way of looking at things. "I knew it," Ji-woo said, and Ji-hoon, with the devastating simplicity of a child who has decided a thing is true and has no more use for deliberation, leaned forward out of his mother's arms and put both of his small hands on either side of Minj's face the way children do, the completely unself-conscious physical certainty of it, and looked at him from 3 inches away. Min's shoulder was bleeding. The floor was cold under his knee. Somewhere downstairs, Park Junho was being managed. Somewhere across the city, Yi was in a room waiting for the shape of her future to become clear. None of that existed. There was only this, his son's hands on his face and his daughter watching with those sharp, honest eyes, and Amara kneeling on the hallway floor with her arms still around both of them, looking at him over Ji-hoon's shoulder with an expression that he had seen on her face exactly once before, 5 years ago, on a night when she'd looked at him across a room and he'd understood with total certainty that he was in a great deal of trouble. She was looking at him like that now. And the war was over and the children were safe, and the truth that had been buried for 5 years was finally, irrevocably out in the open, standing in a hallway in Seoul at 5 in the morning with blood on his jacket and his son's hands on his face. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The shoulder needed 7 stitches. Minj sat on the edge of a hotel bed at 6:15 in the morning while a doctor his organization kept on quiet. Retainer worked without asking questions, which was the only kind of doctor worth keeping on retainer, and he stared at the wall across from him and let himself feel the pain. The way you let yourself feel something you've been holding at arm's length for hours, all at once, without management, without the controlled distance of someone who has things left to do. The things left to do were mostly done. Ji-woo and Ji-hoon were asleep in the adjoining room. They'd crashed within 20 minutes of arriving at the hotel, the way children crash after the body has burned through its entire reserve of adrenaline and fear, completely, immediately, without transition, like switches thrown. Amara had sat between their two beds for a long time after they went under. He'd checked on her once, and she'd been sitting in the dim light with her hands in her lap and her eyes on her children's faces, doing an inventory of something that didn't require words. He'd left her to it. The doctor finished, taped the dressing, said something about antibiotics and rest that Minj acknowledged without intending to act on, and left. Han So came in and sat in the chair by the window. They sat in silence for a moment, the way men who've known each other for 12 years can sit in silence, without it meaning anything other than that the immediate operational pressure has lifted, and neither of them is ready yet to replace it with conversation. Hunho, Minj said finally. Contained. His people are scattered. The operation is... Seo paused, searching for the right word. Disrupted. Not destroyed. He'll rebuild. He'll rebuild differently, Minji said. He's not going to want another version of tonight. Probably not. I'll meet with him next week. We'll draw lines. He shifted his shoulder experimentally and regretted it. What about the documentation? Pak has everything from the server. The original files Yi provided to Junho. Photographs, fabricated message threads, the whole package. He's working on the metadata now. By the end of today, we'll have a complete technical breakdown of how it was assembled and when. Seo looked at him. It's thorough, Minj. She spent real time on it, real resources. The photographs alone, I don't need the details. No, but Amara might. He considered that. Not tonight, he said. No, Seo agreed. Not tonight. Another silence. Yi, Minj said. Seo exhaled slowly. She's asking to speak with you. I know. She's also asking to speak with Amara. That's not my decision to make. Theo nodded. He looked out the window at the Seoul dawn coming up gray and gradual over the city, the skyline resolving itself out of the dark the way it did every morning, indifferent to what had happened under it overnight. What are you going to do with her? Minj thought about it honestly, which meant sitting with the question long enough to get past the first several answers that presented themselves, all of which were variations on the kind of response that the version of him that had existed 24 hours ago, the version before the hallway and his son's hands on his face, might have acted on without much deliberation. I don't know yet, he said. I need to talk to Amara. Seo stood. Get some sleep. In a while. Minj. In a while, Seo. Seo left. He sat alone with the gray dawn and his taped shoulder and the particular quality of silence that exists in a hotel room when the people you've been trying to reach for 18 hours are finally asleep 20 feet away. And the worst of it is over, and what's left is everything that comes after the worst of it. He didn't sleep. At 8:30, Amara came through the connecting door. She'd changed into clothes someone had brought from the logistics facility. Plain, not hers, slightly too large. Her hair was down. She looked, he thought, the way people look when they've been wrung out completely and haven't yet decided how to reassemble themselves. Not broken, but temporarily without the usual architecture. Present. Unguarded in a way that 5 years of building a life alone in a foreign country had probably made very infrequent. She sat on the end of the bed a few feet from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They're still asleep, she said. Good. Jiwoo talked in her sleep. She does that when she's stressed. A small pause. She was arguing with someone. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was very clear. The corner of her mouth moved, barely. She gets that from you, I think. The arguing. I don't argue, he said. You absolutely argue, she said. You just do it quietly, which is somehow worse. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And there it was. The thing that had been underneath every exchange since the cafe, since the restaurant by the harbor, since the airplane and the staging facility and the hallway in Yongsan, the thing that neither of them had addressed directly because there had always been something more urgent, some next move that needed making. The thing that was just the two of them, without the emergency, without the operational necessity, without the children asleep in the next room as both motivation and buffer. 5 years of it, sitting between them in a hotel room in Seoul at 8:30 in the morning. I owe you an apology, she said. Amara, no, let me. She looked at her hands. I know what Yi did. I know she engineered it. I know the photographs were fabricated and the messages were staged, and that you rejected her, and that everything I believed I saw that night was constructed specifically for me to see it." She paused. "I know all of that. And I also know that I ran before I asked you. I know that I made a decision that affected both of us, that affected four of us, without giving you the chance to speak." She looked up. "That's on me. That's mine. Whatever Yi did, the running was mine." He was quiet for a moment. "You were pregnant," he said. "You were scared. You'd just seen something that looked—" "I know what it looked like. I also know that the man I was in love with deserved to be asked before he was convicted." Her voice was even, careful. The voice of someone who has rehearsed something in their head long enough to be able to say it without it destroying them. "I cost you 5 years. I cost your children 5 years with their father. I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing, and I'm not going to ask you to pretend it is." He looked at her for a long moment. "I was not easy to love," he said. She blinked. "I know that," he continued. "I kept things closed. I didn't let you in the way." He stopped. Started again. "You said it on the plane. You said you were scared that you'd been wrong about me because I kept so much shut. That's not Yi's fault. That's mine." He held her gaze. "I gave you reasons to doubt. I didn't give you reasons to stay and ask questions. I thought keeping things at a distance was—" He made a small movement with his good shoulder. "I thought it was protection. For both of us. It was actually just distance." She was quiet. "We were both wrong," he said, "about different things, in different directions. And Yi knew exactly where both of those wrong things were, and she used them." He paused. "That's not forgiveness, and it's not an excuse. It's just the actual accounting." Amara looked at him for a long time. "The actual accounting," she repeated. "Yeah. That's a very you way to describe it." "I know." Something shifted in her face then. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that lives near smiles. The thing that means a person has arrived somewhere that they weren't sure they were going to be able to reach. "What do we do now?" she said. "Whatever you want," he said. "That's honest. You've been making decisions alone for 5 years. I'm not going to walk in here and start making them for you. And if what I want is—" She stopped. "Say it." "What if I want to go back?" she said. "Not to Portugal. I don't mean Portugal. I mean—" She made a gesture that he understood to mean the space before everything went wrong, the version of things that existed before Yi and the photographs and the running. "What if I want to try to find out what that would have looked like? The real version of it, without everything that happened in between." He looked at her. "Then we find out," he said. "It won't be simple." "No. The children don't know you. You don't know them. We've been in a different country for 5 years. I've built a life there. I have a—" She stopped. "There's a lot." "I know. And your world is—" She looked at him steadily. "Your world is what it is, Minj. I've always known what you are. That hasn't changed. And I have children now. That changes the math." "I know that too," he said. And then, because it was the truest thing he had to offer, and he was done offering things that weren't true, "I've been thinking about what I want the rest of my life to look like, since about 5:30 this morning, sitting here. And the version without you in it—" He stopped. "I've already lived that version, 5 years of it. I know what it costs." She was quiet. "Ask me properly," she said, very softly. He looked at her across the bed, across the 5 years, across everything. "Stay," he said. "Bring the kids to Seoul. Let me learn them and let them learn me, and let's find out what the real version looks like." A pause. "Stay." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once, slowly. And that was that. The conversation with Yi happened 3 days later. Amara asked for it. Minj had expected her to. He'd also expected that she would want to do it alone, without him in the room, which was what she asked for and what he agreed to without argument. Some things between sisters exist in a register that doesn't need witnesses. He waited in the hallway. He couldn't hear what was said. The room was solid enough for that, and Amara had closed the door completely. He stood in the hallway for 40 minutes with his hands in his pockets and his shoulder still aching under its dressing, and the particular patience of someone who has learned, late and at significant cost, that there are things you wait out rather than manage. When Amara came out, her eyes were dry. She stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at nothing in particular, and he waited. "She's sorry," Amara said finally. He said nothing. "I don't know if that's true," Amara continued. "I think she's sorry about how it ended. I think she's sorry the children were involved. I think she genuinely believes that what she wanted was real and that what she did was—" a pause. "Justifiable. In some version of the accounting that only exists inside her own head." She looked at him. "She's not well, Minj. She hasn't been well for a long time. I think I've known that for years, and I kept finding ways to not look directly at it. What do you want to do with her?" he said. She thought about it honestly. He watched her think about it. The real consideration, not the performance of consideration. Her jaw working slightly, her eyes somewhere middle distance. "I want her to get help," Amara said. "Real help. And I want her far enough away from my family that I don't have to worry about what far enough means." A pause. "And I want the documentation. Everything Pac pulled from the server. I want to see it." "Are you sure?" "I need to see it. I need to see exactly what was built and how it was built. Not because I don't believe you. I believe you. But because I need to see it for myself." She looked at him. "You understand that?" "Yeah," he said. "I understand that." She saw the documentation 2 days later. Pac walked her through it methodically, technically, without embellishment. The construction of the photographs, the metadata manipulation, the fabricated message threads assembled from real messages with words and dates shifted. The work of someone who had planned carefully and executed over time and had enough access to both of their lives to make the fabrications credible. Amara sat with it for a long time afterward. She didn't cry. He'd been prepared for tears, had been prepared to sit with whatever the documentation produced in her. But what it produced was something more interior than tears. A long, deep processing that she did mostly alone in the hotel room, while the children watched something on a plating in the adjoining room and Seoul went about its business outside the window. He gave her the space. When she came to find him that evening, she looked lighter. Not happy. Not yet. Not from one afternoon of documentation, but lighter in the specific way of someone who has been carrying a doubt for 5 years and has finally, irrevocably, put it down. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "I want to see Seoul," she said. "I've never actually seen Seoul. I arrived here once, years ago, and all I saw was this city through car windows on the way to where you were, and then I left and never came back." She looked at him. "Show me the city." He showed her the city, not the version of Seoul that existed in his operational life, not the back channels and the power structures and the particular geography of someone who had built something complicated in its margins. He showed her the city the way you show someone a place you actually love, which means the small things, the specific things, the things that don't appear in any map or guide, because they exist in the accumulated personal history of a person who grew up there. The market where he'd gone with his mother on Saturday mornings when he was small, before everything got complicated. A rooftop in Bukchon, where on a clear day you could see the shape of the city in a way that made its scale comprehensible and almost peaceful. A restaurant in a basement in Insadong that had been there for 50 years and seated 40 people and had a menu that hadn't changed since the 1980s, and was, in his honest opinion, the finest food in the city, which opinion the chef shared and made no effort to be modest about. Ji Woo ate everything put in front of her and declared the restaurant acceptable, which the chef received as high praise once it was translated. Ji-hoon sat beside Minj at the table with the careful proximity of a child who has decided to let someone into his perimeter but is not yet ready to announce that decision openly, which meant that he kept ending up slightly closer than necessary without appearing to notice that this was happening. And Minj noticed and said nothing about it and made no sudden movements that would disturb the process. It was, all things considered, one of the better evenings of his adult life. 2 weeks after the night in Yongsan, the arranged marriage fell apart. It fell apart because he made it fall apart, which required a conversation with his father's oldest associate, a man named Director Lim, who had been engineering the arrangement for 8 months. That was not comfortable and was not brief, and involved Minj being more direct than Lim was accustomed to receiving. "The situation has changed," Minj said. "The situation. Lim repeated. He was 71 years old and had the patience of someone who had been navigating complicated men for 50 years. What situation? I have children, Minj said, and their mother is here. A pause. The woman who disappeared, Lim said. She didn't disappear. She was driven away. There's a difference. He held the old man's gaze. I'm not marrying someone else, Director Lim. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you out of respect because you've earned it, but the arrangement is over. Lim looked at him for a long moment. Does she know what she's agreeing to? Lim said. Your woman. Does she understand what your life is? She's always known what my life is, Minj said. She made her choice with that knowledge, both times. Another long look. Bring the children to meet me, Lim said finally. I want to see them. When they're ready, Minj said. He proposed to Amara on a Wednesday, not with planning, or rather, not with the kind of planning that involves venues and orchestration and the performance of romanticism. He proposed because they were standing in the kitchen of the apartment he'd rented for her and the children in Yongsan, the one with the view of the river that Jiwoo had selected with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what she wants and sees no reason to be uncertain about it. And Amara was making coffee, and the morning light was coming through the window at that particular angle that Seoul winter light achieves sometimes, low and clean and very clear. And he looked at her standing there in that light and understood with the same quality of certainty he'd felt on a hallway floor 3 weeks ago that there was not a version of the rest of his life that made sense without this specific woman in it. Marry me, he said. She turned around, looked at him. That's not a question, she said. No, he said. It's not. A pause that lasted long enough for him to feel it in his chest. Yes, she said, simply, the way she said most things. They were married in the spring. A small ceremony. Not small because anything was hidden, or because either of them was being modest about what this was, but small because both of them had learned through different routes and at different costs that the things that actually matter don't require an audience. Family. A handful of people who had been present for the parts of their lives that were real. The children, dressed in clothes they'd each been allowed to select themselves, which explained Jiwoo's combination of formal and chaotic and Jihoon's tie, which was slightly crooked and which he refused to let anyone straighten. Minj straightened it anyway, in the moment before the ceremony, crouching to Jihoon's level the way he'd crouched in a hospital hallway 5 months ago, when he'd first said the word that he'd spent those 5 months earning the right to say in everyday practice rather than just in the naming of himself. Jihoon stood still for the straightening. Better, Minju said. Jihoon looked at him with those dark eyes. Are you nervous? He said. A little. Jihoon considered this. Me too, he said. But I think it'll be okay. Yeah, Minj said. I think so too. He stood. Jihoon slid his hand into his without announcement, the way the child had been doing things for 5 months, without announcement, without drama, as a simple statement of fact that he expected no one to make a production of. Minj held his son's hand. They walked in together. In the months that followed, they built something. It wasn't smooth. Smoothness was not, had never been, the particular texture of either of their lives. There were negotiations, adjustments, mornings that were harder than they should have been, and evenings that went unexpectedly right. There were conversations about his work that were not easy, about what it meant, about where its edges were, about the things he was willing to change, and the things that were structural and what structural meant for a family. There were nights when old fears resurfaced in Amara that had nothing to do with Yi or with photographs and everything to do with the simple animal vulnerability of having let someone back in after convincing yourself for 5 years that you were safer alone. He didn't try to argue those nights away. He'd learned, was still learning, that some things need to be sat with rather than solved. He was better at sitting with things than he'd been 5 years ago. 5 years of loss will do that to a person if they're paying attention. The children adapted with the adaptability of children who have been raised by someone with enough strength to make security feel portable, who have understood without being told in so many words that home is a person rather than a place. Jiwoo adapted loudly, announcing her assessments of Seoul with the thoroughness of a small critic given an unlimited subject. Jihoon adapted quietly, the way he did most things, absorbing the new without making a production of it. He started calling Minj Appa about 6 weeks after the wedding. Not ceremonially, not as an announcement. He said it the way Ji-hoon said most things, as a simple statement of a fact he decided was true and saw no reason to hold back. They were eating breakfast, and Ji-hoon wanted the salt, and Minj was closer to it, and Ji-hoon said, "Appa." The salt and Minj passed it to him, and neither of them remarked on it, and Amara, across the table, looked at her coffee cup for a moment before looking up with an expression that she had under control by the time their eyes met. Later, after the children were asleep, she told him she'd been holding that moment in her chest all day. "So had I," he said. "You didn't show it." "I know," he said. "I'm working on that." She looked at him. "You are," she said. "I want you to know that. You actually are." A year after the night in Portugal, a year after a cafe bell and a broken cup, and 5 years of everything arriving all at once, they drove out to the coast. Not Portugal. A different coast. A Korean one. The kind of shoreline that faces east and catches the morning light at an angle that has nothing in common with the Atlantic and everything in common with the quality of beginning. They'd rented a house there for a week, and on the first morning Jiwoo got up early and went to the window and announced that the sea was the same sea as in Portugal, which was geographically inaccurate and completely correct in the way that children are sometimes correct about things, by bypassing the literal route entirely. The cafe in Portugal was still there. Amara had kept it, a decision that had surprised him until she explained it. Not sentiment, she said, though sentiment was part of it, but also because she'd built it from nothing and it was hers, and the fact that her life had expanded didn't mean she was required to leave behind the things she'd made in the smaller version of it. They went back twice a year. The children knew the square and the fountain and the name of the old man who still read his newspaper at the corner table. On the second morning at the Korean coast, Minj sat on the porch before anyone else was awake. The water was gray in the early light, and the air was cold and smelled of salt, which is the smell of every coast in which, he'd discovered in the past year, had become associated in his nervous system with the afternoon he'd sat at the top of a hill in Portugal in a rented car for 60 seconds, deciding whether to drive down. He thought about that 60 seconds sometimes, about what would have happened if he'd talked himself out of it, if the fear of being wrong one more time had been stronger than the certainty underneath it, about how close it had been, about how many versions of the rest of his life had existed in that 60 seconds, most of them smaller and quieter and more manageable, and entirely without the particular weight of what he had now. He heard the door behind him. Amara came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him in the other chair. She handed him one without speaking. They sat with the cold air and the gray water and the sound of the sea doing what the sea does, which is continue regardless. Her hand found his on the armrest between them. He turned his palm up. They sat like that while the light changed and the water shifted from gray to something warmer. And inside the house, the children were starting to wake up. He could hear it, the particular sounds of Jiwoo coming awake at full volume and Ji-hoon's quieter movements. And in a few minutes, they would come through that door and the morning would stop being quiet and start being something louder and more present and more alive than quiet. He was in no hurry. He sat in the thin morning light with Amara's hand in his and the coffee going warm between his palms and the sea moving the way it always moved, constant, indifferent, and somehow, despite all of that indifference, entirely present. And he let himself have it. The whole weight of it. The cost and the finding and the 5 years and the hallway and the crooked tie and the salt passed across a breakfast table and the word that a 6-year-old boy had decided one morning was simply a fact of the world. He let himself have all of it. The door opened behind them, small feet on the wooden porch. "The sea's the same as Portugal," Ji-hoon announced, arriving at his father's elbow with the authority of someone confirming a theory. "Your sister said that yesterday," Amara said. "I know, she was right." He stood beside Minj's chair and looked at the water with the focused appreciation of a child who has decided to take a thing seriously. "Can we go in?" "It's cold," Minj said. "I know." Ji-hoon looked at him. "Can we go in anyway?" Minj looked at the water, at the cold gray surface of it, the waves coming in small and steady, the foam at the shoreline that meant shallow water, safe water, water you could stand in up to your knees and feel the pull of it and know that it was going to be cold and choose to be there anyway. "Yeah," he said. "We can go in anyway." Ji-hoon ran back inside to get his sister. Amara looked at Minj. He looked back at her. She was wearing his jacket over her shoulders. She'd taken it from the hook by the door on her way out, the same way she'd been taking his jacket since 3 weeks after they'd come back to Seoul, which had begun as practicality and become something else, and which neither of them had remarked on because some things are better understood than named. He reached over and turned up the collar of it against the wind. She let him. Outside, Jiwoo's voice was already rising, already narrating the plan for the water with the full-throated certainty of someone who has never in her life been in any doubt about what she wanted, and has no intention of starting now. The sea moved, the light came. And this, all of this, the cost of it and the finding of it, and the imperfect, unsmooth, entirely real weight of it, was what remained when everything else had burned away. It was enough. It was exactly enough. End.